everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today we're going to be focusing on the topic of data and security breaches, and the title of today's webinar is How a Tidal Wave of Data Breaches Could End Up Costing Your Business, and What You Can Do to Protect Your Data, Your Clients, and Your Bank Account. I hope you'll find this presentation interesting and informative, and I also want to mention that we'll have time for lots of questions at the end. But if something occurs to you before then and you want an immediate answer, please just type your question into the Q&A box and one of my associates will let me know and I'll do my best to answer. So with that in mind, let's get started. And our aim today is to talk about the various different kinds of breaches that threaten IT environments, a number of recent examples that will give you a better idea of the scope and magnitude of the threat that we're facing, a discussion of how hackers are able to breach networks, and the concomitant risks to your business. In the process, and once you have a better understanding of the risk factors, we're going to focus on the most common techniques used by hackers, potential impact of a data breach on your organization, where all of this is heading, what are the trends, how to protect your organization, and of course, finally, we'll have time for all of your questions. Now, if you've been on any of our previous webinars, you'll know that I'm not keen on keeping secrets. So here's a quick word about the end of our webinar. If you hang on to the end, we'll tell you about an offer that we put together about blocking the most frequent and most dangerous form of cyber attack. So even if you believe you're already well protected, you'll want to hear what we have to say. Please stay tuned. Now, some of you have probably heard this before, but for the people who don't know me, let me make a brief introduction. I first became fascinated with computers when I was in high school at the age of 14. Now, today, that would make me a late bloomer, but in 1969, I was definitely an outlier. Ultimately, I decided to turn that passion into a profession, and I trained as a software engineer at U of T and York. And while I was still in my final year at York, I started my first business. By the time I was 30, my partners and I were running a software company with 25 employees. And by the time I was 40, we'd grown to 80 employees with offices in Toronto, Montreal, New York, and Los Angeles. I sold that business back in 1995, and I founded Connectability to concentrate on IT infrastructure because I foresaw that the desktop computers and network computing were going to be the foundation of future IT, and I wanted to be there to help other businesses achieve their long-term objectives. Now, in recent years, we've seen an enormous increase in the quantity and the sophistication of cyber attacks, to say nothing of the increased costs that come along with that. And that's why we're holding this webinar. So today we're talking about breaches, but I want to clarify that there are actually two distinctly different kinds of breaches, although sometimes they can be combined into what we might call a hybrid attack. The first of these is a security breach, and this is where your network is penetrated by some form of malware, such as a virus, a Trojan, or a worm. Or it could be ransomware, a form of infection that encrypts all of your files and then forces you to pay a ransom to a hacker to get the decryption key. Or potentially it could be a program called a foothold, which allows a hacker to take advantage and use your computer as a launching pad for attacks on other organizations, or to infect other computers on your network, or to install ransomware, or even steal your data. And that leads into the second form of breach, which is a data breach. And this is typically where a hacker attack leads to a theft of your data. Typically, the hacker will then demand that you pay a ransom to prevent your data from being dumped onto the public internet. A data breach could also involve stealing credentials. For example, they might steal credit card information or banking information, or maybe something as basic as your Amazon login. Now, I'm sure you've heard this subject raised before, and maybe you've read about it online or even in a newspaper. Remember those? But you may not appreciate the scope or magnitude of the problem, nor the extent to which it has become a serious risk for every business. So I'd like to lead you through 7 recent prominent examples. And if you're not terrified by the end of this, you're a braver person than I am. Here goes. Let's start with one of the most widely publicized breaches, the SolarWinds Orion breach from 2020. Now, SolarWinds is a tool set that's used by thousands of IT support organizations worldwide. And I'm not just talking about managed service providers like Connectability. It's also widely used within governments and large corporations. And back in 2020, hackers managed to covertly insert software into the SolarWinds platform. That software went unnoticed for months. But in the meantime, hackers were able to steal terabytes of data from Fortune 500 companies and even the United States Treasury Department. The breach was so bad that it wound up creating congressional hearings in the United States. Here's another breach along the same lines. Kaseya is another company that provides software for IT support organizations. In the summer of 2021, Russian hackers succeeded in attacking one of Kaseya's software tools. That then gave them access to 50 of Kaseya's largest customers. In turn, that gave them access to nearly 1,500 end-user customers, end users of those 50 IT support organizations, representing nearly 1 million computers. All of those computers were infected with ransomware, and the hackers demanded $47 million to reverse it. As a result, many of those customers were down for weeks. As an example, the Swedish supermarket chain Co-op had to close 800 stores for a week, many of them located in small communities who had no other access to food supplies. And even Microsoft's not invulnerable. Recently, hackers discovered a serious vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange, the basis of all Microsoft email services. Now, in fairness, Microsoft identified and patched the vulnerability very quickly. But not all users applied that patch promptly, and as a result, approximately 60,000 sites worldwide were penetrated with confidential data stolen. That's one of the reasons that we speak so highly about the importance of patching your systems quickly. Number 4. Some of you may have read about the Colonial Pipeline hack. Once again, hackers infected their entire network with ransomware, causing the company to shut down for weeks until the infection was eradicated. As one of the largest pipeline companies in the Southeast United States, this created an energy crisis that resulted in long lineups at gas stations all over the South. Here's a very recent hack. Some of you may be familiar with the streaming service called Twitch, which, as it happens, is owned by Amazon. A hacker, probably someone with a grudge against the company, hacked into the company's servers and spilled 125 gigabytes of data onto the public internet. That data included Twitch's source code, so its intellectual property, as well as the salaries and personal data from many people involved with the company. The result of this is that it exposed Twitch to potentially huge lawsuits and fines. So we're now at number 6, and I'm almost finished scaring you. One of the largest insurance companies in the US was penetrated and a large amount of data stolen. CNA Insurance, which incidentally is a company that sells cyber insurance, allegedly paid a ransom of $40 million but it's still not clear whether the hackers retained that data or what the impact might be if they did. By the way, $40 million represents a new record for a publicly disclosed ransom. That should give you a pretty good idea where things are headed. Finally, number 7, the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police was attacked by a ransomware gang called Babook. They stole 250 gigabytes of data that included disciplinary files, salaries, the names of informants, and a lot of other highly confidential information. They then demanded $4 million in ransom, which the police department, like most police departments these days, were not in a position to pay. They did offer $100,000, but unfortunately, the hackers were not satisfied with this and they ended up dumping all of that data online. Now, imagine if you were one of their confidential informants. Now your life is at risk. Okay, so now that I have hopefully educated and probably frightened you, perhaps you're telling yourself that you're not Microsoft or CNA Insurance or the police department, and therefore you're not a target. I wish I could tell you that you're right. But hackers are opportunistic criminals. They don't care who you are, they only care what they can get from you. And if your cyber defenses are not top-notch, that makes you easy pickings, low-hanging fruit for the first hacker who comes along. Have a look at these numbers. According to the Cybersecurity Ventures, their analysis predicts that there's going to be, during this year, a new attack every 2 seconds. That's over 43,000 attacks per day. And somebody mentioned that there was a ransomware attack on the TTC recently. That is true too. Here's another statistic. According to Cybersecurity Ventures, again, the same people, global ransomware damage costs by 2031 are expected to exceed $265 billion US. If you don't believe me, by the way, just Google cybersecurity statistics. So, what are we seeing as the future of cyber vulnerability? First and foremost, there has been a sea change in the goals of hackers. Once upon a time, hackers were individuals who either had a grudge or were just curious to see how easily they could penetrate supposedly secure systems. But today, hackers have realized that their activity can easily be monetized. And so we're seeing huge increases in the amount of ransom being demanded. Back in 2018, the average ransom was $5,000. By 2020, it was up to $200,000. And today we're hearing of demands in the millions of dollars. We're also seeing that cyber criminals are finding new ways to extort money. So where it was once just ransomware on your computers, today we've seen the rise of DDoS, or distributed denial of service attacks, where hackers effectively block access to a website or service until a ransom is paid. We saw this recently with the attack on VoIP.ms and several other phone carriers, including Microsoft. Now, fortunately, all of those carriers were eventually able to work around the attacks without paying the ransom. But that doesn't mean that those workarounds will work the next time there's an attack. Another new form of attack is data ransom. Instead of infecting your computers with ransomware, hackers steal your data and then threaten to release it all on the public internet unless you pay a ransom. And finally, cybercrime is relatively easy to commit. You can even go on the dark web and buy ransomware kits. You can become a ransomwearer. But it's extremely difficult to trace and identify the perpetrators, and even more difficult to prosecute them since the majority carry on their activities from jurisdictions which quietly tolerate or even encourage this activity. That brings us to asking who's behind these attacks and what they have to gain. Well, among the most effective and the best funded hacker groups are state-sponsored cyber warfare groups based in countries like North Korea and Iran, as well as Russia and China. What do they hope to gain? In some cases, they're looking to create instability in their Western opponents. In other cases, it may just be about money. Remember that states like North Korea and Iran are the subject of large-scale sanctions, and access to Western currency is extremely limited. Hacking activity gives them a back channel for generating cash that can then be used to fund weapons development, terrorism, and other unsavory activities. Another source of hacking is organized crime syndicates around the world. They too have discovered that hacking is a relatively low-risk way of generating high profits without putting any of their members directly in harm's way. Terrorist groups are also using hacking to raise money for their various causes. The fact is that the day of the pimply-faced kid in the basement are largely a thing of the past. Today, hacking is big business. So, now that we've discussed the what and the who, we should probably talk about the how. How are hackers so successful at penetrating systems that should be well protected? However much these people are criminals, the fact is that they're smart criminals who have many tools at their disposal for evading your defenses. So let's have a quick look at a few of them. One common tool is a Wi-Fi sniffer. If you use your phone or your tablet or your laptop in a public place on public Wi-Fi, a sniffer will allow them to capture all of your Wi-Fi traffic. Now that traffic could be encrypted, but it isn't always, and even if it is, hackers have tools that will sometimes allow them to decrypt that information. There's also a trick they use called phantom Wi-Fi, where they set up what looks like a legitimate Wi-Fi access point in a place like Starbucks, but it's actually their portal designed to capture every keystroke you type. Another source of critical information is compromised credentials. There are sites all over the dark web devoting to selling login credentials, usernames and passwords for thousands or perhaps millions of users worldwide. And while not all of that data is accurate, there's enough accurate data to provide a field day for a dedicated hacker. And worse still, whenever there's a large-scale data compromise, like the recent compromises at TJX, Home Depot, and others, millions of new credentials are spilled onto the dark web. Still, another form of attack is called brute force hacking. The hacker creates a program that generates thousands of permutations of passwords until one of those works. But once they're in, they can wreak all kinds of havoc. Far and away, however, the most successful form of hacking is phishing, sometimes combined with social engineering. A hacker will send you an email, perhaps containing personal information that only a few people would know, and inviting you to click on a link. Once you do, they can install software on your computer that could start a ransomware attack or allow them to take control of your entire network. We'll be talking more about this when we talk about how to defend your networks. But just before we get there, here are a few other things that you need to think about. First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, although all of the examples we reviewed were larger organizations, that doesn't mean that small to medium-sized organizations are safe. It just means that they're underreported because the news cycle is much more interested in big news. Second, consider that the 7 examples I cited are just a tiny fraction of the total number of breaches that have occurred over the past 18 months or so. Third, you may have heard that a large number of traditional crimes, for example rape, go unreported. The same is definitely true for cyber intrusions. For many privately held companies, publicly disclosing that they have been breached would be a significant embarrassment that could lead to lost business. So they keep their mouths shut. That doesn't mean that the breach didn't happen. Finally, I mentioned the notion earlier of a hybrid attack. Remember that hackers are very clever, I keep saying that. So for example, they could use ransomware, a ransomware attack, to disguise the fact that they've stolen your data. You could be so busy trying to mitigate the ransomware attack that you don't even consider whether or not anything was stolen in the process. Okay. So I hope we've done a pretty thorough overview of the threat landscape. But now I think it makes sense to bring this discussion back to where it really matters, to your organization. What are the risks to you and your organization if you do get breached? And as you can see from this chart, there are a lot of risks. Some of them minor, but many of them significant enough to threaten the health of your business. So let's review a few of those now. First up, a serious virus or ransomware attack could put your business on hold for a week or longer. Could you afford to go for a week or two without taking orders or shipping products? Or if you're in the finance industry, could you conduct trades without access to your records? Second, what about your reputation? If it ever gets out that you were breached, especially if it was a serious breach, would your customers ever trust you again? And wouldn't this give your competitors a wedge they could use against you? Third, governments are starting to mandate fines, sometimes stiff fines, for companies that allow their confidential data to be breached. Could you afford to pay those fines if it happened to you? And what about litigation? If hackers leaked critical information belonging to your customers, how exposed would you be to potential lawsuits? Finally, if you're in an industry like finance or healthcare or real estate, where there are very specific licensing requirements, you could lose your license as a result of a breach. All of these risks are serious, and you need to do everything in your power to make sure none of this ever happens to you. So here's the obvious question. How are you going to keep yourself safe? And I need to preface everything I'm about to tell you by saying that there's no such thing as a perfect cyber defense. However thorough you may be, and however clever the people who develop cybersecurity tools, you have to remember that hackers are just as clever. But if you make your defenses strong enough, most hackers will move on to someone whose defenses are not as strong. Think of it this way. If your house has an alarm system and your neighbor's house doesn't, which one is a burglar going to choose? So having said all of that, we believe that the only effective defense against cybersecurity breaches is a layered cyber defense, sometimes called a security stack. Essentially, we look at your IT environment like an onion, with your desktop computers at the inner layer, the network at the next layer, and so forth. And that's what this diagram portrays. And what this means is that there's no such thing as a single tool that does everything. You may have the best antivirus software in the world, but that won't prevent someone from using a stolen password to hack into your systems and steal your data. Likewise, you may have a great firewall, but if you're not scanning and filtering your emails, that firewall may not help at all. It's only by having the right combination of security tools that you can be reasonably assured that your organization is safe from most attacks. So, let's move on to some of those tools. And let's start with some free things that you can do to increase your security. I mean, everybody loves free. And the first place to start is passwords, because passwords are the keys to your kingdom. A compromised password could let a hacker into your network, causing potentially irreparable damage. So here are some very important things to remember. Number one, and I can't stress this too much, don't use the same password for everything. Because if you do that, if a hacker gets your password for your email, he or she then has access to everything in your digital life. Number two, use complex passwords or even phrases. Don't use your kid's name or your dog's name, because those are easy to guess. Don't use ABC123 or 123456. We've seen those many times. They're easy to guess. A common trend now is to use a phrase like, I live at 101 Main Street. Change your passwords regularly, at least once every 6 months. And because I'm advocating that you don't use the same password for everything, I realize, of course, that it's going to be difficult to remember all of those passwords. So we recommend the use of a password manager. Now, if you're a client of Connectability, we offer My Glue to all of our clients for free. If you're not a client, or you'd rather sort of keep that within your own window, you could look at a product like LastPass, which, when I last checked, is free for personal use. Never share or expose your password. Don't put it on a Post-it note and stick it to your monitor. Don't put it on a note in your desk. That's too obvious. And don't share it with anybody in your workplace. And finally, never type in your password if you're connected to a public Wi-Fi network. It's too easy to sniff that out. Remember that protecting your passwords is one of the most critical elements of cybersecurity. And here's another freebie. Multi-factor authentication, sometimes called MFA or 2FA. Very simply, you require a second token, typically a 6-digit number, in order to access a website or your email, even if you already have the password. And you need to have an authorized device, typically your mobile phone, in order to get that second token. So even if a hacker gets your password, there's no way they can access your account without that second token. And the good news is that many, in fact, most websites and email services offer this capability for free. That includes banks, investment companies, Microsoft, Google, and so forth. We at Connectability use this method for accessing all of our cloud-based tools, including our remote monitoring tools, password database, and many other cloud services. And while at first it may seem like a lot of extra work, frankly, you get used to it very quickly. Then there's patching. Both Microsoft and Apple do a pretty good job of detecting security flaws and vulnerabilities. And as soon as they do, they promptly issue security patches to keep their desktop operating systems secure. Both Windows and Mac OS can and should be configured to install those patches automatically. It's important that you do this, and these days you can usually schedule those patches to be installed at a time that won't interrupt your workflow. But what about mobile devices? Many people use their smartphones and tablets to access confidential company information. But mobile devices can also be hacked, and mobile devices have security flaws. And while Apple and Google are also pretty good at identifying and patching those flaws, unfortunately on mobile devices, at least today, you cannot always program them to automatically install those patches. So if you do receive a notice on your phone that there are updates available, it's important that you don't wait too long before installing them. Next freebie, AUP, an acceptable usage policy. Every business should have one. This lets your staff know what they can do with their computers and what they should not be doing. At a minimum, it provides some structure around the use of the technology that you own. If you don't already have an AUP, we can provide you with a free template. Just send your request to info@connectability.com. And finally, at least in terms of freebies, there's policy enforcement. If you have a Microsoft Active Directory environment, or you're using a sophisticated remote management tool, you can enforce policies that restrict what your users are allowed to do. For example, do you want your users to be able to download and install software without your permission? We don't recommend that. That could easily lead to a ransomware attack or a foothold infection. Similarly, can a user just plug in a USB device and transfer data? Again, we recommend against this because it could allow them to steal confidential company information, or it could unintentionally introduce malware onto your network. But using policy enforcement can restrict these activities, as well as others, leaving your network much safer. Unfortunately, that's it for the free tools. But the good news is that even the tools that have associated costs are still pretty inexpensive. And frankly, if you compare the cost of those tools to the costs you would incur if you experienced a serious data breach, or even a minor one for that matter, you'll see that there's no comparison. An ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure. But before I talk about those tools, here are a few thoughts about cybersecurity that you'll always want to keep in mind. First and foremost, ensuring that you and all of your team members are educated about cybersecurity risks is key. We like to say that the biggest risk to your organization walks on two legs, and I don't mean kangaroos. It's important that your team members are always alert and aware of the dangers. Investing in cybersecurity awareness training will help you stay safe at a nominal cost. If you're interested in hearing more about it, we offer several tools and we'd be happy to discuss it with you. Second, it's essential that you have effective, complete, and thoroughly tested backup for all of your data. In the worst case, for example, a successful ransomware attack, only effective backup will allow you to recover quickly without having to pay the ransom. And finally, you can't have too much protection. Cyber criminals are always looking for vulnerabilities that they can exploit. Just remember, security is asymmetric. While you need to have perfect defenses, a hacker only needs to find a single vulnerability. So let's return to this slide. And you'll recall that I mentioned that the only effective defense is a layered defense. So I'd like to peel back the layers and in the process give some examples of the kind of tools that we recommend. And I'm going to start with the inner layer, the inner ring, and work my way out. What does that mean? Well, just before I get there, I'd like to see if I can make the notion of a layered defense a little more real. So here's a very physical example. It's called a concentric castle, and you can see that it has an outer moat, then fortified outer walls, and then even higher fortified inner walls. All of this is designed to make it extremely difficult for in this case, attackers, to reach the inner keep of the castle. Each time the barbarian hordes get through one layer of defense, they have to face an even more difficult one. And this is the same philosophy that we've applied when it comes to cyber defense. In other words, a series of challenging layers of security designed to make it extremely difficult to perpetrate a successful attack. So we're going to start at the innermost ring, the castle keep, if we're going to stay with the analogy we were just looking at. In cybersecurity terms, that means your users and the computers that they use. So what precautions do we need in order to keep them safe? Well, first and foremost is a solution that you're all very familiar with, and that's antivirus software. And it doesn't matter whether you're using a PC, a Mac, or even a Linux computer. There are viruses and other malware that target all of them. Just as important, you have to do your research. All antivirus software is not created equal. For mid-level antivirus protection, we recommend WebRoot. That's our favorite product, but we also like Bitdefender and ESET. And if you're looking for higher-end, enterprise-grade protection, you could choose one of the solutions used by Fortune 100 companies. And those would include products like SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, or Cylance. Now, those are more expensive than the mid-range products, but they're also a lot better at detecting and stopping very new or so-called zero-day infections. The other tool you need to employ at the desktop level is effective and regular patching. We talked about this earlier. Don't postpone or delay patching simply because it's inconvenient. A modern computer will reboot in under 2 minutes, and that 2 minutes could mean the difference between a ransomware attack or safety. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, education and awareness are critical. We sometimes refer to users as the unit between the desk and the chair. The better informed you are as a unit, the less likely you are to fall for a phishing or social engineering attack. I see there's a question, will the slides be available for download after the presentation? The video is going to be posted on our YouTube channel, and I believe the slides will be available, yes. Okay, so let's move outward one layer and look at the next level of security, and that's the security on your network. A lot of people miss this, but here are some questions for you to think about, starting with, is your network physically fully secured? Could somebody, perhaps wearing a janitor's uniform or a Bell technician uniform, walk into your office, plug a laptop into a live network jack, and access your servers? What about your Wi-Fi? Is it secured with the latest level of encryption? Are your Wi-Fi access points running the latest firmware to ensure that they're secure? And are you allowing your users to connect their personal devices to your corporate Wi-Fi network? If you're doing that, then what happens if their personal device has been compromised? And that's why we always recommend setting up a guest Wi-Fi network that's completely isolated from the rest of your IT infrastructure, and insisting that your staff only use that network with their personal devices. Number 3, is your network locked down through the use of policies? For example, we mentioned this earlier, can your users download and install software without permission? If so, that's a dangerous precedent that could easily lead to a ransomware infection or foothold. And finally, would you know if a hacker was somehow connected to a backdoor on your network and using your computers for nefarious purposes? That kind of activity is usually undetectable unless you're using an advanced intrusion protection tool like Huntress. So, on to the next layer, the perimeter. The perimeter is the border between your carefully constructed IT infrastructure and the Wild West of the internet. How are you protecting that border? Have you invested in a real business-grade firewall? Or are you just using the basic modem or router provided by your internet provider? You need to know that those routers, those basic routers, provide very little intelligence or protection, and a skilled hacker can often slice through them with ease. An effective business-grade firewall will not only prevent hackers from getting in, it will also prevent your team from unintentionally going out to websites that could introduce malware onto your networks. But even if you do have a real business-grade firewall, are you sure that it's configured properly with no unsecured backdoors or vulnerabilities? And do you know if the firmware and the detection patterns are completely up to date? So let's imagine that I'm a hacker outside of your perimeter wall trying to get inside. And let's say that you did the job right and you have a pretty much impenetrable firewall. How am I going to get around that? The answer is pretty simple, because it's one of the few things that does get through every firewall, and that's email. Phishing is the single most common form of attack. Phishing is also how the most successful hacks have been accomplished in the past, and that includes companies like JP Morgan Bank, Home Depot, Target, TJX, and a lot of others. Why is phishing so effective for hackers? There are a few answers. And number one, I keep saying this, but it's important to understand that most hackers are pretty smart. They're warped, but they're pretty smart. So they do their best to copy legitimate emails from legitimate sources, like Microsoft or large banks. And where possible, they'll even try to integrate personal information about you so it looks even more real. And unless you know exactly what to look for, phishing emails can look pretty realistic. Number two, we have a saying that frankly some people will click on anything. And by that we don't mean that they're malicious, it's just that they don't really know better, they haven't been properly educated. And finally, number three, as good as they are, most firewalls and antivirus solutions offer only very limited protection against spam. So a lot of spam will not be caught by those tools. What will catch spam and phishing is email filtering. Now, both Google and Microsoft have email filtering built into their platforms. So you won't get many ads for Viagra or Canadian pharmacies. But the filters that are built in have a much harder time with more subtle phishing attacks. And that's why we use, and we always recommend, advanced email filtering solutions like Proofpoint Essentials, one of the world's leaders in spam filtration. A good filtering solution will ensure that only a tiny fraction of junk mail that hits your mailbox every day actually gets through. Now, to be clear, no filtering solution is perfect. There will always be a small amount of spam that evades the filters. Frankly, it's a cat and mouse game between the spammers and the filtering companies. But having a solution like Proofpoint in place will make it much less likely that you'll be fooled by a phishing attack. And in a few moments, I'm going to talk about how you can leverage that level of protection for your business. Now, just before we wrap up, I want to address the question of cyber insurance. We get asked about this a lot. So do you need it? Is it worth the money? Well, here's our answer. We think it's something that every business should seriously consider. With the current risk landscape, a breach could cost you dearly, and cyber insurance can help you weather that storm. But that said, it's like any other form of insurance. You really don't ever want to have to use it, because if you do, it means that you've been hacked, and the consequences are serious enough that you had to get your insurance company involved. Consider this. If you're breached, your insurance company will bring in forensics experts to try and determine how the breach occurred, what, if anything, was stolen, and how to prevent future attacks. Now, those are all positive things. But what if the damage to your business reputation was so severe that it takes you years to recover lost business, if you ever do? Will your cyber insurance policy cover that? I doubt it. And that's why we encourage our customers to have this coverage, but we work diligently to ensure that you never need it. So now I'd like to circle back and summarize a few key points from our discussion today. Specifically, as you'll recall, some of the recent cyber attacks are terrifying in their scope and impact, and the volume is increasing every day. Only a layered cybersecurity defense that's properly configured and managed, as well as being monitored, will prevent something like that from happening to you. And finally, every organization should be asking itself what it needs to do to ensure that it's not the victim of a cyber attack. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of our talk that we have a special offer for you, so here goes. If you're a current connectability customer, we want to help you protect your organization from the constant onslaught of phishing attacks. So we're offering a 10% reduction for the first year on Proofpoint Essentials, a class-leading email filtering solution used by many of the Fortune 500. If you're already using an email filtering tool, you can give us a call and we'll offer you the same discount on some other protections that could help make your organization more secure. And if you're not a connectability customer yet, we still want to help. So we're offering to provide a comprehensive network and security audit for 1/3 of the price we normally charge for this service. So what will an investment in cybersecurity do for you? First, and simply put, it will make sure your data remains safely in your possession. It will protect your organization's reputation and ensure that your IT environment is safe from intruders, and ultimately, it will deliver peace of mind. So if you're ready to take advantage of one of these great offers, please email Aberna, her address is here on the slide, or give us a call on our main number, or you can post your request in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll get the ball rolling. And please remember that the deadline for these promotional offers is next Friday, November 26th. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. We really appreciate it. And now I'd be happy to answer any questions. And you can just type them into the Q&A box and I'll do my best to respond. How regularly should passwords be changed? Do you have a recommended password manager? Okay, so first question. The frequency of change depends on a lot of things. If, for example, you're using two-factor authentication and you are using separate passwords for everything, then I don't think you have to change your password very often. Because 2FA prevents someone without your authenticating device from accessing it, or from accessing your email, for example, it means that even if they get your password, there's limited damage that they could do. In fact, likely not much. The second question, do you have a recommended password manager? Well, again, for our clients, we offer MyGlue, which is very effective. For people who are not clients or prefer to sort of control it themselves, probably the best known one is LastPass. And as I think I mentioned earlier, that one is free for personal use to the best of my knowledge. However, all you have to do is bring up Mr. Google and type free password manager, and I'm sure you will find many. Karen's asked if we can put the email address back on the screen, and I will do that right now in the chat. Okay. Oh, sorry, it's in the chat, pardon me. How do we encourage all staff members to seriously follow a cybersecurity policy? Some find it difficult to change the ways they're accustomed to working, like saving passwords in a notepad. I totally understand. And it is difficult, changing people's habits, whether it's cybersecurity or anything else, is always challenging. Part of it is having an acceptable use policy, and one of the things that we recommend with an acceptable use policy is that employees are required to read it and sign it once a year. And part of and what should be in an acceptable use policy, among other things, is the passwords never get written down. Passwords are kept, if they have to be kept somewhere, they're kept in a secure password manager. That's one. So that's one way of dealing with it. Another thing really is to ensure that your staff members go through online cybersecurity training. Again, if you're using one of our cybersecurity training tools like Bullfish or a WebRoot security awareness, you have access to those tools, and we strongly encourage you to put your staff through that training at least once a year to refresh their memories, because among other things, it will re-familiarize them with the risks that they might face. I hope that was satisfactory answer. Are there links to those training programs? If you're I'm sorry, your links that will provide information about those training programs, we can certainly send that to you. Sorry, I know that I think Brad and Aberna are monitoring this chat, so if you would send that information to David, both about the about Bullfish and the WebRoot program, please. Another question. If a phishing email does pass through the spam filtering tool, what should I do next? What we recommend is that you forward it to us. We will then forward it to the software tools company for evaluation, and often that results in tuning of the filters. If you're finding that a lot of stuff is getting through, we can increase the intensity of those filters. The potential risk, if we do that, is that some legitimate emails could be blocked. But what we find is most of the time, the default settings do a pretty good job. Any more questions? Okay, it says, we already have an email filtering. What's the next most important security tool that should be implemented? Well, assuming that you have good antivirus software and a business grade firewall that has been appropriately, correctly configured, I would say the next defense that you should consider is intrusion detection and prevention. Specifically, one of the tools that we recommend is Huntress. Huntress looks for a different kind of attack and infection. Basically, it looks for those back doors, those footholds, and it alerts you not only to the presence of those footholds, but to potential vulnerabilities that could allow footholds to be installed. Another thing that you could consider if you're using a product like WebRoot or ESET or Bitdefender is you could consider looking at something like SentinelOne or Cylance or CrowdStrike. They are more advanced artificial intelligence-based antivirus programs, and they are extremely effective. They are, however, as I mentioned, somewhat more costly, typically 2 to 3 times more costly than the mid-range competitors. That obviously doesn't particularly concern Fortune 100 companies who use them because it's a drop in the bucket for them. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions, but if you're interested in learning any more, or if something occurs to you afterward, please feel free to send a note to info@connectability.com. And again, I thank you for your time today, and I hope to see you on our next webinar. Take care, everybody.